Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on caravels, crowns, and the Columbian Exchange. The core question is this: why did European crowns, sailors, and merchants risk Atlantic crossings? And how did those motives turn exploration into conquest and exchange? The core competency is to articulate the causes of European exploration and the variety of their New World endeavors. What kind of state spends ships, silver, and sailors on an Atlantic crossing, and what return does it expect in law, power, and empire? European exploration of the Atlantic did not begin as a wandering search for wonder. It developed through rivalry among states that wanted wealth, access to trade, and dynastic strength. By the late 15th century, rulers in Iberia had already learned that maritime expansion could reshape taxation, military power, and diplomatic standing. Ocean travel cost money and lives. Ships had to be built. Sailors had to be recruited. Food, water, rope, cannon, timber, and navigational instruments had to be stocked. Rulers approved those costs because the payoff promised more than curiosity could justify. Spain reached that calculation in 1492 under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The same year they backed Columbus, they completed the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. The victory reinforced Christian monarchy and sharpened the prestige of expansion. Religion and war, therefore, sat next to commerce from the beginning. Iberian rulers had fought for territory at home and were prepared to apply similar language of service, faith, and victory abroad. Portugal had already shown what a smaller Atlantic monarchy could gain from systematic seaborne expansion. Decades before Columbus, Portuguese rulers sent mariners down the African coast to seek gold, direct trade, and routes around Muslim intermediaries. Those expeditions did not happen all at once. Each voyage produced route knowledge, coastal contact, and technical lessons that the next voyage could use. Step by step, the Atlantic turned from a feared edge into a managed corridor. Political economy helps explain the shift. Crowns wanted bullion because bullion paid soldiers, supported courts, and strengthened government credit. Merchants wanted direct access to spices, sugar, slaves, and other goods that could return large profits. Church authorities and monarchs wanted conversion and prestige attached to expansion. The motives worked together. Faith gave moral cover, profit paid the bills, rivalry pushed the timetable forward. By 1492, a voyage west could therefore look rational to a monarchy. Columbus was not offering a detached scientific experiment. He was offering a route claim that might place Spain ahead of Portugal and open new opportunities for trade, land, tribute, and conversion. The Atlantic voyage became a strategic gamble backed by state authority. The world before Columbus already contained the machinery of exploration. Portuguese mariners spent the 15th century building that machinery piece by piece. Prince Henry the Navigator supported voyages along the western coast of Africa. Sailors learned to read Atlantic wind systems and currents. Cartographers improved coastal maps and portolan charts. Pilots accumulated knowledge of shoals, harbors, and return routes. These were technical gains, but they were also administrative gains because crowns could store the information and reuse it. The caravel became one of the most important tools in this process. Its lighter build and flexible rigging made it useful for Atlantic conditions. Mariners could maneuver more effectively and respond to shifting winds. Navigators also used the astrolabe and compass to supplement dead reckoning. None of these instruments eliminated danger, but together they reduced uncertainty. Sailing long distances stopped being purely speculative and became more repeatable. Portuguese expansion also depended on Atlantic islands and coastal bases. Madeira and the Azores functioned as proving grounds for settlement, sugar cultivation, and maritime logistics. Along the African coast, the Portuguese built trading posts that concentrated commerce and gave the crown a more durable presence. Elmina, established in present-day Ghana in 1482, became a major center for gold trade. These outposts changed imperial reach because they let rulers protect cargo, gather information, and claim strategic sites before rivals could do the same. The search for direct access to Asian goods drove much of this development. European consumers wanted spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. Overland and Mediterranean routes involved many intermediaries, and Atlantic rulers wanted a way around them. That commercial desire interacted with older habits of crusading conflict. Christian rulers still viewed Muslim-controlled trade as both an obstacle and a provocation. Maritime exploration promised to weaken that dependence. Portugal also linked exploration to slavery before Columbus crossed the Atlantic westward. Portuguese traders purchased and transported enslaved Africans through expanding coastal exchange. Labor systems on Atlantic islands, especially sugar cultivation, showed how land, shipping, and coarse labor could reinforce one another. By the time Spain funded Columbus, the Atlantic already contained route knowledge, colonial experiments, and labor coercion. The oceanic world did not begin innocent and then turn violent later. Violence and profit entered the structure early. These Portuguese precedents explain why Columbus's proposal received serious attention. A crown no longer had to imagine the Atlantic from nothing. It had examples of ships returning with gold, claims, captives, and geographic intelligence. That evidence made further risk easier to justify. The actors in early exploration did not enter the Atlantic with the same pressures. Monarchs wanted prestige, territory, and revenue. Merchants wanted profitable cargo and protected routes. Sailors wanted wages, survival, and promotion. Priests and royal officials wanted conversion and legal order under the crown. Those interests overlapped often enough to keep voyages moving. Christopher Columbus embodied several of those pressures at once. He was a mariner from Genoa seeking backing for a westward route that he believed could reach Asia. He needed royal sponsorship because no private sailor could assemble ships, crews, and supplies at that scale alone. He also needed titles and rewards to make the venture worth the danger. The capitulations of Santa Fe promised Columbus noble rank and a share of profits if the expedition succeeded. The agreement tied personal advancement to imperial expansion. Crews also faced the Atlantic as a material problem. Long voyages meant spoiled food, uncertain water supplies, storms, disease, and mutiny risk. A sailor did not need grand theory to understand the stakes. If the route failed, he might drown, starve, or return empty-handed. If the route worked, he might earn wages, prestige, or access to future ventures. Oceanic expansion depended on those ordinary calculations as much as on royal ideology. Merchants and officials saw the ocean through accounting. Cargo value had to exceed voyage cost. New claims had to justify military defense and legal administration. A single successful route could alter customs revenue and diplomatic leverage. That is why exploration quickly moved beyond mapping into settlement, tribute, and extraction. Once a crown invested in a voyage, it had strong reason to turn discovery into possession and possession into revenue. Religious actors also shaped the process. Priests, monarchs, and chroniclers described expansion in terms of conversion and Christian obligation. That language gave coercion moral cover because it gave moral cover to coercion. It also shaped how Europeans interpreted the peoples they met. Communities became potential converts, tributaries, workers, or enemies in a Christian imperial frame that left little room for equal sovereignty. The Columbian exchange emerged from those combined pressures. Voyages carried not only people and plants, but also seeds, livestock, microbes, and insects across the Atlantic. Horses, cattle, pigs, wheat, and sugarcane moved west. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco moved east. Disease moved with even greater force. Smallpox, measles, and influenza struck native communities that had no prior exposure to those pathogens. The exchange was not an abstract circulation of goods. It was a biological and demographic transformation tied directly to ships, empire, and labor demand. Columbus's 1493 letter to Luis de Santangel reads as a possession report meant to secure more support. He described islands, people, and resources in a form that invited further investment. He wrote of inhabitants who could be converted and of places that could be claimed. He wrote for royal readers who wanted proof that the voyage had enlarged Spain's possibilities. The language of the letter shows how quickly observation became strategy. Columbus described the people he encountered as vulnerable to Spanish direction. He also emphasized the apparent fertility of the islands and the potential for future gain. His report worked as a sales document for empire. It told the crown that the voyage had opened more than a route. It had opened a field for possession, labor, and Christian monarchy. The pressure lies in what the letter does not measure. It cannot account for epidemic disease that will follow repeated contact. It does not reckon honestly with coercion. It does not present native peoples as nations with their own political claims. Instead, the document narrows a large human world into categories useful to sponsors: souls, resources, land, and advantage. That narrowing is itself a mechanism of empire. Once a crown receives land, mainly as opportunity, conquest becomes easier to justify. Columbus therefore appears less as a lone adventurer and more as a functioning part of a larger system. The letter shows a mariner already writing in the language a monarchy wanted to hear. He was reporting where he had been and arguing for what should follow from the voyage. He was arguing for expansion. He was placing the voyage inside a wider competition with Portugal and inside a Christian imperial framework that treated new lands as available for royal use. The letter also clarifies why the Columbian exchange cannot be described as neutral contact. The same ships that carried crops and animals also carried military claims, forced labor plans, and pathogens. European paperwork framed the results as legitimate gain. The letter records the opening move in that process. The document also hints at labor expectations that later hardened into colonial routine. Columbus emphasized serviceability, fertility, and pliability because crowns and investors wanted territories that could be governed and worked. A possession report therefore already carried the logic of settlement, tribute, and extraction. The consequences of exploration spread quickly beyond route finding. Spain moved to secure claims through further voyages, settlement, tribute, and conquest. Portuguese expansion continued around Africa and into the Indian Ocean while deepening its role in Atlantic slavery. Other European powers watched carefully and began preparing their own ventures. A successful route changed diplomatic maps and invited imitation. The Columbian exchange transformed food supply and population patterns around the world. American crops such as maize and potatoes increased food possibilities in Europe, Africa, and Asia. European livestock altered landscapes in the Americas. Sugar plantations expanded on Atlantic islands and later in the Caribbean and Brazil. Those plantations demanded labor at a scale that intensified the Atlantic slave trade. Exploration therefore linked directly to forced migration and racial labor systems. Disease created one of the most devastating consequences. Smallpox and other infections moved faster than many imperial institutions understood. Native populations in numerous regions suffered catastrophic losses, weakening communities before they could fully assess the threat. Epidemic disease magnified conquest by disrupting leadership, labor, and resistance on top of the violence already spreading through imperial contact. Maritime contact carried biological power that reshaped the balance of force. State competition also hardened. Once one monarchy gained claims, rivals sought equivalent advantage. Charters, forts, colonial administrations, and naval protection followed. Exploration became the front end of empire. A voyage could no longer be separated from the systems that pursued land titles, labor control, and military defense afterward. What began as rote speculation became a pattern of occupation. The early Atlantic world thus combined technical skill with violence, commerce with mission language, and curiosity with state ambition. Caravels, charts, and royal contracts made distant ventures possible because they made distant ventures possible. Mercantilism drove policy because crowns wanted measurable returns. The Columbian exchange transformed daily life because biological and agricultural transfer changed daily life across oceans. Smallpox devastated communities because the human cost of contact was immediate and uneven. These are not separate topics. They are parts of one mechanism. By the close of the 15th century and the opening of the 16th, European rulers had learned that ships could bring back more than news. They could bring back claims, captives, tribute, disease, and political leverage. That lesson drove the next century of imperial expansion and set the stage for conquest, plantation labor, and colonial settlement across the Americas. The navigational feat is no longer the only question once crowns learn that Atlantic crossings can return claims, labor systems, and imperial leverage. The harder judgment is whether political communities measure exploration by seamanship alone or by the structures of conquest it makes possible. That choice never stays safely in the 15th century.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.